The fastest way to discover a person's character is to give them the power to dismiss someone they believe does not matter. Every Friday evening, the dining room at Ashford House became a stage where elegance met silence. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of chandeliers. Soft piano music drifted through the air. Conversation stayed low, measured, and polite. Every table was reserved weeks in advance, except one. Table 7 belonged to William Harrison whenever he chose to appear. No reservation was ever required. No one questioned it. The billionaire chief executive officer owned nothing inside the restaurant, yet somehow everyone behaved as though he did. Managers straightened their jackets the moment his black luxury sedan stopped outside. Servers quietly exchanged nervous glances. New employees learned one rule before anything else. Never disappoint Mr. Harrison. The front doors opened, allowing a cool autumn breeze to sweep across the polished hardwood floor. William entered wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit beneath a charcoal overcoat. His silver Swiss watch caught the chandelier light as he removed one leather glove. He acknowledged no one with more than a brief nod. Confidence surrounded him without effort. So did impossible expectations. Within 3 minutes, the first server approached his table carrying sparkling water. William looked at the glass for only a second before calmly sliding it aside. This was poured too early. The young server apologized and hurried away. 2 minutes later, another server arrived with a fresh setting and a revised menu. William glanced toward the folded napkin. The crease is uneven. The second server quietly lowered his head before stepping back. A third employee attempted to recover the situation by recommending the chef's seasonal special. William listened politely, then closed the menu without ordering. "Thank you. I would prefer someone else." Around the dining room, conversations slowed. Even guests began noticing the uncomfortable pattern. 3 experienced servers had failed before dinner had even begun. Near the service station, whispers spread quickly. No one volunteered to approach table 7. Again. Emily Carter stood silently beside the espresso machine, drying a porcelain coffee cup with a clean towel. She had worked double shifts all week. Her black apron showed the faint signs of a long evening, yet every movement remained steady and unhurried. A cold cup of coffee rested untouched beside a stack of handwritten receipts. She had forgotten to drink it hours ago. The restaurant manager hurried toward her with visible anxiety. "Emily," he whispered, "I need you to take table 7. Several co-workers looked at her with sympathy. Others looked relieved that it was not them. Emily folded the towel neatly before placing it on the counter. "All right," she answered softly. She picked up a small leather order book, straightened her apron, and walked across the dining room without rushing. William looked up as she stopped beside his table. Their eyes met for the first time. He expected another nervous apology before she even spoke. Instead, he found a woman whose calm presence seemed completely untouched by his reputation. Emily offered a gentle professional smile. "Good evening, sir. My name is Emily. I hope your evening has started well." William studied her for several long seconds before answering. Then, without opening the menu, he quietly said, "That depends entirely on whether you become the 4th person I send away tonight." Emily did not answer immediately. She simply placed a neatly folded linen napkin beside William's place setting and adjusted the water glass by less than an inch until it aligned perfectly with the edge of the table. Only then did she look at him again. "Then I will do my best to make your evening worth staying for." There was no challenge in her voice. No fear either. Just quiet professionalism. William leaned back slightly, studying her expression. Most servers tried to impress him within the first minute. Others apologized for mistakes they had not made. Emily did neither. She stood comfortably, holding her order book without gripping it too tightly, her breathing slow and steady despite the dozens of curious eyes watching from across the dining room. "Tell me," William said, "what would you recommend if you knew?" Absolutely nothing about my preferences. Emily glanced briefly toward the kitchen before answering. I would recommend the chef's signature filet with roasted vegetables because it is prepared consistently every evening. A recommendation should be based on reliability, not assumptions. William raised one eyebrow. You did not try to sell me the most expensive item. You asked for a recommendation, not a sales presentation. A faint silence settled between them. Nearby, the restaurant manager pretended to organize reservation cards while secretly listening. Several servers slowed their pace just enough to watch what happened next. William closed the menu completely. Very well. Bring me the filet. Medium rare. If it arrives even slightly overcooked, I will send it back. Understood. Emily wrote only a few words before walking calmly toward the kitchen. She never looked over her shoulder. The manager hurried after her the moment she reached the service station. How did you do that? He whispered. Emily smiled gently while handing the order to the chef. I only listened to the question he actually asked. The chef nodded once and immediately began preparing the meal. Emily reached for her cold coffee but stopped when she noticed an elderly couple quietly studying the dessert menu without saying a word. She walked over, answered their questions with the same patience she had shown William, then returned to polishing silverware as though serving one of the richest men in America required no different attitude than serving anyone else. 15 minutes later the entree was ready. Emily inspected every detail before leaving the kitchen. The steak rested perfectly beside roasted vegetables arranged with care. The sauce had been placed in a separate dish exactly as requested. She carried the plate through the dining room with measured steps and gently placed it before William. He looked at the presentation without speaking. Then he picked up his knife and made the first cut. The center revealed the exact shade of medium rare. Around the room, several employees quietly released the breath they had been holding. William tasted one bite, set down his fork, and looked directly at Emily again. Interesting, he said calmly. You have passed the easiest part of tonight. Now let us see how you handle the difficult one. Emily remained beside the table without the slightest change in her expression. She did not ask what William meant. She simply waited. Silence had become one of the strongest tools in her profession. People often revealed themselves when no one hurried to fill the empty space. William folded his napkin with deliberate precision before speaking again. I visit restaurants for one reason, he said. Not because I enjoy expensive food. I come to observe people. Emily nodded once. Observation can teach a great deal. It certainly can. He lifted his glass of sparkling water. In the last 10 minutes, you have corrected the position of my glass, recommended the most reliable meal instead of the most profitable one, and never once apologized for mistakes made by someone else. That is unusual. Emily answered quietly. Taking responsibility and accepting blame are not always the same thing. William looked at her with renewed curiosity. That sentence did not sound rehearsed. It sounded lived. Before he could respond, a young busser accidentally brushed against a nearby chair while carrying a tray of empty plates. One fork slipped onto the carpet with a soft metallic sound. The young employee immediately froze, his face turning pale as several guests looked toward him. The restaurant manager started walking quickly across the dining room, frustration already visible in his expression. Emily reacted first. Without drawing attention to herself, she calmly stepped over, picked up the fork, handed the young man a clean replacement from her apron pouch, and quietly whispered, "Take a slow breath. Everyone drops something eventually." The young employee nodded gratefully before continuing his work with noticeably steadier hands. The entire moment lasted less than 15 seconds. Most guests barely noticed. William noticed every second. Emily returned to his table as though nothing important had happened. "Would you like fresh pepper, sir?" she asked. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the nervous young employee who had just escaped an embarrassing moment. You protected his confidence, William observed. Emily gently turned the pepper mill once in her hands. Confidence is harder to rebuild than a dinner service. William rested his elbows lightly on the table. You speak as though you have managed people before. Emily smiled politely but offered no explanation. Life teaches different lessons to different people. Again, she refused to make herself the subject of the conversation. That intrigued William more than any impressive resume could have. Most people rush to tell successful strangers about their accomplishments. Emily seemed determined to let her actions speak instead. As she prepared to excuse herself, a sharply dressed man entered the restaurant carrying an expensive briefcase. The manager immediately hurried forward with an unusually nervous smile. Emily noticed the exchange from the corner of her eye. So did William. The billionaire's calm expression changed almost imperceptibly the moment he recognized the newcomer, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, his attention shifted completely away from the dinner in front of him. The man carrying the leather briefcase crossed the dining room with the confidence of someone accustomed to private meetings and closed doors. The restaurant manager greeted him personally, offering a handshake that was noticeably warmer than the one he had given any guest that evening. William watched the exchange without moving. His fork remained untouched beside the half-finished fillet. Emily quietly noticed the change. Until that moment, William had observed everyone else. Now he was the one observing a single person with unusual intensity. Do you know him? Emily asked only after making certain her question would not interrupt his thoughts. William answered without looking away. Unfortunately. That single word carried more weight than an explanation. The visitor disappeared into a private dining room at the back of the restaurant. Two additional men in expensive suits followed a few moments later, carefully closing the door behind them. The manager immediately instructed another server to make certain no one disturbed the meeting. Emily glanced briefly toward the hallway before returning her attention to William. Would you care for dessert this evening? William almost smiled. You noticed I lost my appetite. You stopped tasting your food. Emily replied calmly. You have been looking toward that room every 12 seconds. William looked at her for the first time since the visitor arrived. You counted? Only because patterns are easier to notice than words. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The soft piano continued filling the restaurant while rain began tapping gently against the front windows. William rested one hand on the table beside his Swiss watch. The man who just arrived has been trying to convince my company to sign an agreement for months. Emily simply listened. He is persuasive, William continued, but I have never trusted him. Emily refilled his water glass without interrupting. Trust usually disappears before evidence arrives. William slowly nodded. That is an unusually thoughtful observation. Emily smiled politely. Working in a restaurant teaches you to notice what people hide between conversations. At that moment a server hurried past carrying a silver tray toward the private dining room. Emily's eyes briefly followed the tray before settling on the server's shoes. One lace had come loose, dragging lightly across the polished floor. Without drawing attention, she stepped forward and quietly stopped him. 1 second. She knelt, tucked the loose lace safely beneath the knot, straightened the edge of the tray, and stepped aside. You are all set. The server thanked her softly before continuing without spilling a single glass. William had witnessed the entire moment. She had prevented a problem before anyone else even realized it existed. No applause. No recognition. Just another quiet act that kept someone else's dignity intact. As Emily returned to table 7, a muffled sound echoed from behind the closed private dining room door. The conversation inside had suddenly stopped. Every member of the staff instinctively looked toward the hallway. William's expression hardened. Emily noticed something different. The restaurant manager, who had seemed relaxed only moments earlier, now looked genuinely unsettled as he hurried toward the private room without meeting anyone's eyes. Emily watched the restaurant manager disappear through the private dining room door, then quietly returned her attention to the guests around her. Experience had taught her that uncertainty spread through a dining room faster than any spoken rumor. A delayed meal could be forgiven. Visible panic could not. She walked to the elderly couple she had helped earlier and refreshed their tea before they needed to ask. She offered fresh bread to a family celebrating a birthday. She smiled at the young busser whose confidence she had protected only minutes before. One calm decision after another slowly restored the gentle rhythm of the evening. William noticed every detail. He had expected curiosity. Instead, Emily chose responsibility. Moments later the manager emerged from the private room with forced composure. A faint sheen of worry remained across his face despite the practiced smile he offered nearby guests. He walked directly toward Emily. "I need you to cover the private room for the next course," he whispered. Several nearby servers immediately looked away. Everyone understood the assignment carried unusual pressure. Emily nodded once. "Of course." Before she turned, William spoke quietly. "Do you always accept the most difficult table?" Emily looked back at him with the same composed expression. "The table does not know it is difficult. Only people decide that." William rested his hand beside his untouched coffee spoon. "You make everything sound simpler than it is. Most situations become more complicated after fear joins the conversation." She offered a polite smile before lifting a polished serving tray and walking toward the private dining room. William remained seated, but his attention followed her instead of the closed door. Inside the room, the atmosphere felt noticeably different from the peaceful dining area outside. 3 businessmen sat around an oval table covered with financial reports, untouched wine glasses, and expensive fountain pens. The visitor with the leather briefcase barely acknowledged Emily as she served each plate with quiet precision. While placing a dish before one of the guests, she noticed a folder resting partially open beside the briefcase. She did not read its contents. She simply noticed the signature page had been left blank while every other document had already been initialed. It was an unusual detail, but she immediately looked away. Her responsibility was service, not curiosity. As she reached the doorway to leave, one executive said softly, "Once he signs tonight, there is no turning back." Another answered, "He still believes he controls the negotiation." Emily continued walking without changing her pace, but those words lingered in the silence. When she stepped back into the main dining room, William looked directly at her. Before she could return to table 7, the restaurant manager intercepted her with visible urgency. "Mr. Harrison wants the check immediately," he whispered. Emily glanced toward William. He had not asked for the check. In fact, he was calmly watching the private dining room door, as though waiting for something no one else had yet realized was about to happen. Emily accepted the leather check folder from the manager without questioning him. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," she said quietly. The manager avoided her eyes while smoothing the front of his jacket. "Just bring it to Mr. Harrison." His voice sounded unusually strained. Emily nodded and walked back toward table 7 with her usual measured pace. William looked up the moment she arrived. Before she could place the folder on the table, he spoke. "I did not ask for the check." Emily stopped. She glanced briefly at the closed folder, then toward the manager standing near the service station pretending not to watch them. She gently set the folder on the edge of the table instead of directly in front of William. "That is what I expected," she replied. William folded his hands together. "Then why did you bring it?" Emily answered with complete honesty. "Because someone wanted me to. I thought it would be better to let you decide whether it belonged here." William's eyes narrowed slightly. It was a subtle answer, but it revealed something important. She had followed instructions without surrendering her own judgment. He slowly opened the folder. Inside was not a restaurant bill. It contained a single typed note with one short sentence. Please leave now. The private meeting cannot be delayed any longer. William read the message twice before quietly closing the folder again. He did not appear surprised. Instead, he looked toward the private dining room with renewed certainty. Interesting, he murmured. Emily remained silent. Do you know what this means? William asked. No, she answered. And I would rather not guess. A faint smile appeared at the corner of William's mouth. Most people would have. Emily gently lifted the untouched cup of coffee that had grown cold beside his plate. Guessing often creates problems that facts never intended. William watched her replace it with a fresh cup. Steam slowly rose between them, carrying the familiar aroma of roasted coffee beans through the quiet dining room. You replaced my coffee even though I never asked. Emily nodded. The first cup became cold while your attention was somewhere else. William looked into the fresh coffee before speaking again. You notice everything, do not you? Only the things people quietly reveal. Before either of them could continue, the private dining room door opened. The businessman carrying the leather briefcase stepped into the main dining room wearing a confident smile, followed closely by the restaurant manager. They appeared ready to leave. William remained seated, showing no intention of greeting them. Instead, he calmly reached into his inside jacket pocket and removed a fountain pen. He placed it beside the unopened folder and looked directly at Emily. One last question, he said. If someone wanted you to sign something important tonight, but every instinct told you the timing was wrong, what would you do? Emily looked at the pen, then at the closed folder, before meeting William's eyes once more. I would never let urgency make a decision that wisdom has not finished examining. The smile disappeared from William's face. Across the room, the businessman had just noticed that the billionaire was still sitting exactly where he had been an hour earlier, and for the first time that evening, confidence began to fade from the visitor's expression. The businessman slowed his pace the moment he realized William had not signed anything. The confident smile that had carried him through the evening faded behind careful politeness. He changed direction and walked toward table 7 with measured steps. The restaurant manager followed half a step behind, attempting to appear relaxed, though the tension in his shoulders told a different story. Emily quietly stepped aside, allowing the two men to approach without interruption. William, the businessman said warmly, I was told you had already finished dinner. William looked up with complete composure. You were told incorrectly. The businessman laughed softly. It happens. William rested one hand beside his untouched fountain pen. It does. Especially when people become impatient. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The piano continued playing in the background while rain tapped gently against the tall windows overlooking the quiet street. Guests nearby sensed something unusual but could not hear the conversation. Emily remained beside the table, ready to refill a glass or remove a plate if needed. She never pretended to belong inside a business discussion. She simply fulfilled her responsibility. I hope we can still review the agreement tonight, the businessman continued. Everything has already been prepared. William glanced toward the leather briefcase. Prepared by whom? The question seemed simple, yet the businessman hesitated just long enough for Emily to notice. So did William. Our legal team, he answered. William gave a slow nod. Interesting. He reached for the folded note that had arrived inside the check folder and placed it quietly on the table. Then perhaps you can explain why someone wanted me to leave before dessert. The businessman looked at the paper. His expression remained controlled, but the brief silence that followed spoke louder than any denial could have. The restaurant manager looked equally surprised. I have never seen that note before, he said. Quickly. William turned toward him. I believe you. Emily noticed the manager blink in confusion. William continued, because if you had written it, you would not have delivered it through the one employee in this restaurant who has refused to manipulate a single situation all evening. Emily lowered her eyes slightly, uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. William looked at her for a moment before addressing the businessman again. She brought me the folder exactly as instructed, but she allowed me to make my own decision. That difference matters. The businessman forced another smile. Surely we are giving too much importance to a misunderstanding. Emily quietly picked up the empty dinner plate and paused for only a second. Respectfully, she said, misunderstandings usually become dangerous only after people stop asking honest questions. The dining room became remarkably still. Even the nearby conversation seemed to fade into the background. William slowly stood from his chair, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked directly at the businessman. For the first time tonight, he said calmly, I finally know which person at this restaurant deserves my trust. The businessman expected William to extend a handshake. Instead, the billionaire turned toward Emily first, leaving everyone else wondering what he was about to say next. Emily looked at William with quiet surprise. She had expected him to return to his conversation with the businessman or simply leave the restaurant. Instead, every person's attention now rested on her. She remained composed, holding the empty dinner plate with the same steady hands that had carried every course that evening. William spoke in a calm voice that carried across the silent dining room without ever becoming loud. Miss Carter, you have spent the last 2 hours doing something very few people manage to do. Emily waited politely. You never allowed my position to change your judgment. She answered with a gentle smile. A person's title tells me how they earn a living. It does not tell me who they are. The words settled over the room like the final note of the pianist's melody. Even the businessman seemed unsure. How to respond? William slowly nodded. Exactly. He turned toward the restaurant manager. Earlier this evening you asked her to serve my table because no one else wanted it. The manager lowered his eyes. Yes, sir. And before she ever reached my table, 3 experienced servers had already failed. That is correct. William glanced around the dining room. Do you know why she succeeded? The manager hesitated. She remained calm. William smiled faintly. No. She remained honest. He looked back at Emily. You never tried to impress me. You never tried to flatter me. You answered only the questions I actually asked. You noticed details without invading anyone's privacy. Most importantly, you protected people who had nothing to offer you in return. Emily looked down for a brief moment before quietly answering. That is simply part of the job. William gently shook his head. No. Serving food is part of the job. Preserving another person's dignity is a choice. Silence filled the restaurant once again. The young busser Emily had encouraged earlier stood near the service station listening with wide eyes. The elderly couple smiled warmly from their table. Even several guests who had never spoken to Emily all evening now watched her with quiet admiration. William reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the folded note that had arrived inside the check folder. Without unfolding it again, he placed it beside his untouched dessert spoon. This piece of paper was meant to pressure me into making a rushed decision, he said. Instead, it reminded me how valuable clear judgment really is. He looked directly at the businessman. Our meeting is over. Any future discussion will take place in my office with my legal team present. The businessman attempted one final polite smile. William, perhaps this can still be explained. William answered with complete composure. Perhaps. But not tonight. The businessman quietly closed his briefcase. Without another word, he walked toward the exit. The restaurant manager watched him leave, visibly relieved that the evening had not become a public spectacle. William then turned back toward Emily. Before I leave. There is one mistake I still need to correct. Emily looked at him with calm curiosity, unaware that the next few words would leave the entire dining room standing in respectful silence. William took one slow step toward Emily until they stood only a few feet apart. The restaurant remained completely silent. Even the pianist had stopped playing without realizing it. William looked at the woman he had spent the evening testing, questioning, and quietly measuring against standards that had become impossible for almost everyone around him. Then, in front of every guest, every server, and every manager, he spoke with complete sincerity. "Miss Carter, when I arrived tonight, I believed excellence could be demanded. You reminded me that it must be earned." Emily lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "I only tried to do my job well." William gently shook his head. "No. You did much more than that." He reached into his wallet and removed a simple business card. Unlike the elegant cards his assistants normally distributed, this one carried only his direct phone number. He placed it on the table rather than handing it to her. "If you ever decide your future belongs somewhere beyond this dining room, call me. Not because I believe I am offering you an opportunity, but because I would welcome the opportunity to work beside someone whose judgment I trust." Emily looked at the card but made no move to pick it up immediately. "That is very generous." William smiled quietly. "It is also completely selfish." Several guests laughed softly, easing the final traces of tension that had filled the room all evening. "Companies spend millions of dollars teaching leadership," William continued. "Tonight I learned one of the most valuable lessons from a waitress carrying a tray instead of a title." Emily finally picked up the card with both hands. "Thank you." There was no excitement in her voice. No triumph. Only quiet gratitude. The restaurant manager stepped forward. "Emily," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology as well. I kept giving you the hardest tables because I knew you would never complain. I should have thanked you instead." Emily offered the same gentle smile she had shared with every guest that evening. "Tomorrow is another shift. We can simply start there." The manager nodded, understanding that forgiveness sometimes arrived without speeches. William placed enough cash inside the check folder to cover the meal and a generous gratuity for the entire service team. "Please divide this equally," he said. Everyone contributed to tonight. The young busser looked at Emily with quiet admiration. The elderly couple smiled warmly as they prepared to leave. One by one, conversations returned to the dining room, but something had changed. The atmosphere felt lighter, almost warmer than before. William buttoned his jacket and walked toward the entrance. Just before reaching the door, he stopped and turned back. "Good night, Emily." She met his eyes and answered with the same calm voice that had welcomed him hours earlier. "Good night, Mr. Harrison. I hope the rest of your evening goes well." He smiled, then stepped into the cool autumn air where the rain had finally stopped. A week later, Friday evening returned to Ashford House. The chandeliers glowed. Soft piano music filled the room once again. Emily stood behind the counter beside another untouched cup of coffee that had slowly grown cold during a busy shift. The front doors opened. William Harrison entered wearing the same tailored navy suit. This time no one rushed in fear. No one whispered. Before anyone else could greet him, William looked directly at Emily, inclined his head with genuine respect, and said, "Good evening." Emily smiled and welcomed him exactly as she welcomed every other guest. Nothing about her had changed. That was precisely why everything else had. Because the quiet ones are never truly ordinary.